Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Sorry, we are a few minutes behind. Just give me 1 second and we will get started. All right. Hi, Sam. Are you with us?
Yes, hi. Thank you, Haley.
No worries. Okay, so thank you everybody for joining us. I think we're gonna get started as people continue to trickle in. So welcome to day 2 of the Lenfest News Philanthropy Summit. My name is Haley Slesser. I work at the Lenfest Institute as a communications associate, and I have a few housekeeping items before we begin. Give me 1 second. Hold on. Give me 1 second. I'm having a problem with Sam's video. We are having some technical issues. Please give me 2 seconds and I promise you we will begin. Okay, I don't know how to change the video settings and I'm really, really sorry about that. Okay, wait, make him a co-host. I don't think that's an option. Give me a second.
Okay, oh. I think I did, and sorry, I didn't mean to type that to everyone, but
no, it's okay. I'm sorry that I'm technologically inept despite being 22 years old.
Did that help, Sam? I think you're a co-host now.
Let's find out.
There he is.
Oh, there we are. Thank you so much for your patience. I'm so sorry about that. Okay. All right. Back on track here. So a few quick housekeeping items. I'm sorry we're a few minutes behind. Our event principles are on the main page of the Zoom events. I will put them in the chat. Please continue to be respectful of your colleagues in this space. Also, this session is being recorded and will be shared out publicly following the summit. Closed captioning is available and can be turned on by clicking the button labeled CC Show Captions at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you're having technical difficulties, message me. I know I don't seem like the great source for that now, but I promise you I will do my best to help you all out. And at the end, we'll take questions. So please use the Q&A tool at the bottom of your Zoom screen to pose a question to the speakers. But I will let you guys take it away. Again, thanks for being patient and we'll get started.
Good. All right. Well, thanks for everybody for joining us today. Sorry for being a few minutes late. So I'm Sam Cholke. I'm the manager for distribution and audience growth. And I'm really happy to be joining Virginia here today to talk about research you can use. So audience research.
Yeah, thank you, Sam. So hello, everyone. I'm Virginia Arrigucci. I am Deputy Director of RevLab at the Texas Tribune. Just a little quick intro about the RevLab. We exist to share best practices with other publishers from the Tribune, particularly about our revenue model. So even though we're a nonprofit, we work with publishers of all kinds. And as you might know, the business model for news is constantly changing. So one of the other things we do is help with internal projects at the Tribune. to help us keep adapting and growing that model. So that's one of the things I'm here to talk with you about today, is a project that we worked on in 2022. And then one last quick shout out, a couple of my colleagues, Sewell Chan and Terry Quinn, are going to be giving a keynote later today. So I really recommend you tune in for that, and they'll be sharing more about our fundraising practices. Oh, hey, Rodney. All right. So can you go one more, Sam?
Sure.
Thank you. All right. So yes, one of the projects we worked on internally in 2022 was an audience research study. And this was the most comprehensive audience research that the Tribune's done since founding in 2009. And thanks to a generous grant from GNI, it was the first time we were able to work with a professional research firm, which gave us a lot more insight than we can typically do with just like SurveyMonkey. So for this project, we worked with Magid Associates, and they helped us construct and conduct a 3-phase research study. So stepping back a little bit, there were a few reasons why we wanted to do this work. And the main reason was that in 2018, we created this really ambitious strategic plan. And part of that was a goal to double and diversify our audience by 2025. And last year, we were at about halfway into that 7-year plan, and we found ourselves in a really interesting place. So the plan was written in 2018. The world a lot's happened since then. And over those years, excuse me, because of COVID and, the tragic, winter storm in 2021, we actually reached our goal to double our audience much faster than we'd ever imagined. And that was great, but we were a little bit lost thinking, okay, we didn't anticipate our growth coming in this way, and we really didn't know who this new audience was. And we especially didn't have data on our second goal, which was diversification. We had no idea how diverse this audience was. And although that plan was very well intentioned, it really wasn't well defined on what diversity even meant. So this project was really helping us take stock of our strategic plan and set some more goals, especially around benchmarking. So not to go on too long, but phase 1 was the benchmark of our current audience using a survey. Phase 2 were focus groups, and phase 3 was a survey of Texas news consumers, closely mirroring the population of Texas from the most recent census. Okay, can you go to the next slide? There we go. So I'll dig in a little bit more to the findings later, but just very top line, some of the things I'll just share at the top are that yes, we did, as suspected, find that our audience is much older, richer, whiter, more educated than the general population. And that was even more true among small donor members. And yeah, we do have a long ways to go in diversity on many fronts, but especially there was a large gap among reaching Latinos, who make up 40% of the Texas population. So that emerged quickly as a priority. And then last, the findings generally told us that if we really want to work on this diversity goal, we need to change a few of the things that we're doing. So our current audience has different ideals of what they're looking for in a news source, and they're also getting news in different ways. So with that, I'll let Sam talk a little bit about his research work.
Thanks. So I'm Sam Cholke. I'm the manager for distribution and audience growth at INN, which means, like, by and large, I deal with audience questions, audience strategy questions, with the 400 plus newsrooms that we represent, which includes the Texas Tribune. My personal background over the past few years is working on directly these kinds of surveys, talking to audiences in specifically these kinds of ways through surveys and focus groups, both through INN, but also through Medill's Local News Initiative, and a little bit with helping out News Revenue Hub as well. So I've done 9 of these in the past, I think, year, and then done 1 large market survey in the similar ways that the Texas Tribune has as well. And I could talk a little bit too about, like, what of this is accessible to you now? Like, what can you do without Magid, without like a huge investment of cash or time? And what is really sort of like the next step for you, and what do you get for spending the bigger money to do something bigger on the market research side. And I think it's important to think about like these in two distinct ways. And I think Virginia helped really us start to think about that, which is the audience survey is helping us understand what are the constituencies that are the most closely identify with our mission, and what actions and feelings like help reinforce that for them. But then like what's the context that those people live in? Like that's one relationship that they have. What are all the other relationships that they have? And what are all the other relationships that exist out there? And that's where the market survey comes into. And it's a much more complex thing to tackle. And it's much more challenging to interpret. It's much more expensive to do. But what we're trying to understand is what are the existing attitudes and needs around news, and how are people attempting to meet those needs? And like, where do I fit into that? And where are the gaps still that I might like occupy in the future? Sorry, I went backwards instead of forwards. So let's start at the first one, the audience survey. So I've done a whole bunch of these last year. I did one with a newsroom in Chicago, and we came out of it with not a sense of like the audience. There's no audience. There are a set of like constituencies within our audience. What are the types of people that build relationships with us over time, and what do those relationships look like? And so I might come out with a couple that look like this. This is kind of loosely based on one that we did. 25 to 45 years old, college educated. They use newsletters to feel informed and find things to do. But then when they want to go deeper on something, they're usually like using search. They have a strong belief in supporting community-based organizations, but they don't necessarily have a track record of giving to nonprofit newsrooms or for-profit newsrooms. And their relationship with this specific organization is really like strongly identified with the way this newsroom has partnered with local artists in the past. Like that really showed them what this organization was about and what their mission was. So this is really helpful because we understand a lot about like the shape and dynamics of this specific relationship. And we can start to understand too, like how many other people are out there that are like this? Like what's our space to sort of like run with what we're already good at? And I can do some stuff for free. And I should say like up to this point, like everything that I've talked about is largely free to do. Like you can do a survey of your audience for practically nothing, if not nothing. And even understanding like the shape of the people that are out there is in some ways free. So like I can go and look at census data and understand how many people out there are this age bracket. I can understand the same things about their education status just from census data. I can even get like a rough sense from Pew Research Center data about like sort of attitudes about news. But like, are they open to paying for news? Do they have a positive feeling about reporters, those sort of things? I can sort of guess at it using smart estimates from Pew data. But if I want to understand all this other stuff, habits, sentiment, like a sense of values that these people have, I need to go out there and understand really how they think. And I want to understand like how audiences think from their perspective, starting from their perspective and then working back to the news. So this is where a market really helps us start to understand stuff. So this is a actual map of like the organizations, news organizations that people in the South and West sides of Chicago interact with and have a strong relationship with. So when we talk about like news ecosystems all the time, this is what it looks like, right? These are the interactions that they're having. Like how many news sources do they have? How do their attitudes and values change based on the ones that they've selected? Like where is there space where like, if I'm a radio station, is there space do people accept new radio stations versus a digital brand? Do people accept new digital brands? Like I can tell you in Chicago, like don't start a radio station. People don't adopt new radio stations. Do start a digital news. People are very open to picking up a new digital source for news. So like you can start to pick it apart and like understand the interrelationships of like, what are the spaces being occupied? What are those spaces meant to accomplish for people? And what are the spaces still left open? So this is one for like ABC News, which is the most popular news source on the South and West side of Chicago, highly trusted. And there's like a lot of sets of attitudes around ABC News. For example, looking at people who are really heavily engaged with ABC and have strong feelings about them, the high levels of satisfaction, they don't really think that news is something worth paying for, right? They're getting it for free. And this is a really common belief, right? But it's something that I want to understand as a news organization when I'm going out to serve a constituency. Like, what's the value of news to them? What's the culture around news in this place, or to this group, to these people? So like 54 to 71, what does that mean? So 54% is what the national average is, according to Pew data. 54% believe that no one should have to pay for news. Like news is something that should just be free for people. On the south and west sides of Chicago, those attitudes rise to 71%, right? So for me, it tells me a couple things. Like it tells me like that I'm entering into a culture that's different from the culture I might have been working in already around news, but general attitudes around news, like foundational attitudes around news. And then like I might need some more space to do stuff. I might have to make a different type of sell. I might have to convince them of other things beyond sort of just that I'm worth supporting. I might have to convince them that news is worth supporting. For us in INN, like these are really important questions for us to have to grapple with. And it also helps us understand the gaps that are out there, because the gaps that are out there are often not in those identities that we see in the US Census of like, 18 to 24-year-old Black men. That's not the identity necessarily that's being poorly served. The poorly served identity might be little village resident who's also a parent, who's a boomer, but was of the age where they were not eligible for the Vietnam draft. It's a thing in Chicago for some reason. I don't understand why still. And they're politically active. They're like actively working on campaigns and this sort of stuff. There's an intersection of different identities that are at work for them. And it's an intersection of a couple of those that end up creating the gaps. So we need to understand these things, both when we think about how we want to like start work or expand our work, like how does this connect to the identities and the attitudes we're already sort of like in conversation with? And how might we need to change both how we do our work, but also more importantly, how we talk about who we are, how we talk about our relationship to them and the type of relationship we want to build over time. So I know, Virginia, like you've been thinking about this a lot too. Maybe you could tell us a little bit more too.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. So, like Sam said, one of the reasons that we wanted to do this is that we know the story around audience is much more nuanced. Different segments have different views, and we really need a strategy that's more garden hose than fire hose if we're going to pull this off. So, knowing there's many different constituencies we wanted to reach, one of the things we did in our news consumer survey was we showed this list of 12 descriptors, and we asked people to rate on a scale of 1 to 10 how much it described their ideal news source. So I'm also kind of curious if people want to type in the chat, like which one of these you might rate a 10. That could be kind of a fun thing to look at. But what we did with this is not just looked at the whole of how the whole survey responded to these, but we sliced up respondents in a few segments of interest to really look at where there would be differences in these ideals among these groups. And so we did find that there were differences, but we also found there were some areas of commonality, which was interesting too. And really the overall point of this, as Sam said, is just to understand how we should talk about ourselves. And really among other than long histories and news source, our brand could arguably be any of these things. So how we talk about ourselves is really key to how we reach new audiences. And to address one of the questions in the chat, I think this is also key to reaching donors. Like, how are you describing the work that you're doing? So we have a couple responses in the chat: independent, nonpartisan. Okay, that's really interesting. So if you want to advance to the next slide, please. Okay, so the way we did this, I'm showing just 2 examples of the segments we looked at. The first groups I'm showing here on the left is age, and on the right is political leaning. The left one shows differences between older and younger Texans, and the far right column, the third column there, older Texans. They were a little bit more difficult to please in general, rating a lot of these ideals lower than other groups. But one thing that stood out is they rated the value of nonpartisanship fairly high. And they were among one of the only groups we looked at who did that. So that was interesting to us. In the middle, on the right side graph, are responses from Black or African-American Texans. And similar to young people on the left, they generally rated most of the ideals fairly high, but the ones that they rated lower were nonprofit and nonpartisan. Can you advance one more? Okay, and This one on the right, we have political leaning. So to answer another question from the chat, we did look at conservatives. We are under indexing a bit on conservatives. So we did look particularly at this group. And for this one, it was really interesting. Opposite of younger and Black Texans, conservatives generally rated almost every ideal lower, with the exception of independent, in-depth, and represents Texas. And on the left side graph, when we look at LGBTQ+, what really stands out here is they much more highly valued giving voice to the less powerful and investigating social problems compared to non-LGBTQ. Can you go one more, please? All right, so aside from this just being really fascinating, some of the key takeaways here are that pretty much every group valued represents Texas very highly. So there were not that many areas of commonality, but that was something that emerged as maybe the #1 ideal for every group. So that's great news, because leaning into that messaging means we're not going to alienate anybody. That's something that everybody really likes. And we know from other research too, that consumers generally are looking for authentically local brands. And secondly, another area of commonality was that no group really valued nonprofit. So that, if you look at the bottom here, this is on our website. That's one of the first ways that we describe ourselves to donor appeals for members, is that we're a nonprofit. So of course, it probably is good to make people aware that you're a nonprofit, that you need and want donations, but that may not be the best foot forward. People generally want more than that. And that was confirmed by our focus groups, with people having general kind of skepticism for nonprofit, and that didn't mean anything positive on its own. Independent was also something that was fairly well received across all groups. And again, nonpartisan, I know some people in the chat said that really appealed to them. You're the exception. So this happens a lot in news orgs. We kind of design for ourselves and what appeals to us, but that is not how audiences are thinking. So instead of a nonpartisan, independent is a great word to describe essentially the same thing that might be a lot more resonant with people, including donors. And then the last point here, giving voice to less powerful, investigate social problems, and celebrates communities. These were really positive for some groups, but not all. And these were especially positive for many of the groups that we're trying to reach under that diversity umbrella. So we're going to need to find a way to embody those values, message about them, and connect that to, in a targeted way to those groups.
Yeah. So I want to take a minute now to try and put this all together. So what do you do with all this information? So we're going to I'm just going to play around with a hypothetical for a minute. This is a hypothetical very, very closely related to reality of what it's like for news outlets on the south and west sides of Chicago dealing with and trying to serve a mostly Black and Hispanic audience. So this is a real need that we saw come out of the survey we did in Chicago, which is a strong demand for housing coverage in a really concentrated area, right? That's a real opportunity for us, right? A lot of people want and know they want a very specific type of coverage. And it's lots of people who are in a similar life position to those we serve now, right? Might be similar income and age brackets, but it might also be parents, homeowners, other sorts of identities. They have good engagement with the other types of news organizations that we're kind of like. So, so it's likely that they would get what we do in some basic sense. But there's a low willingness to pay for news. There's no track record of giving to news in the past, but they do give to community nonprofits. In this hypothetical, maybe my organization is really heavily reliant on a newsletter strategy, but if this community doesn't use newsletters, they're on social media. They don't particularly like anything that allows me to communicate with them via email or phone, push alerts, text messages, email, newsletters, nothing like that. It's their news habits are mostly related around using social media to feel update on the news events. They find some issue that they care about, and then they'll search for it and then read the things that they find through search, usually on a website, right? So I have a website, I can do that. I know I have teams that work on search stuff. I know I can do that. So I start to see the shape of an opportunity here. Like there are people we know how to serve. We have some products that will work for them. We know they have a need that no one else is meeting. So here's an opportunity. The questions I would start to ask myself in the role of the news organization are, what are the existing reporting resources and products that work for this constituency? Do I have a housing reporter? Do I have a reporter that works on housing in the way that this community thinks about it? Do I have products that work for them, right? Like if I am like putting all my money and time and energies and putting my staff time into growing newsletters, and this is not a community that's going to engage deeply with newsletters, like how do I make this work for them then? And like for this specific example, like how am I going to stay in touch over time to understand if what I'm doing is working or not? Like particularly with this one, it's challenging because they don't want to give me their email. They don't want to give me their phone number. I want to talk to the same person over and over again to understand how their attitudes might be changing. How am I going to do that? And then how are we going to support this work, right? Like, is housing something that a local funder is interested in? Like they may not articulate it as housing. They might articulate it as working families, but they don't support journalism. Is there an inroad for me here now that I can demonstrate a need? And how do we adjust our expectations, knowing that we're going into a community where there's just a different culture around news than the ones that we typically serve? And like, how are we going to adjust our expectations based on that? And like what we consider to be success, and like also how we're going to financially support the work that we're doing. Like if donations are not the strategy, like maybe we look into events, maybe we look into something else that is more like culturally resonant with this particular audience than what we've done in the past. And I need to ask myself questions about like, am I ready to invest in an event strategy or not? Or am I like looking at newsletters and I want to keep my resources tied up in newsletters for a little while longer? So with that, I mean, like Virginia, like you're kind of like looking for these now and you're like getting a bunch of this information. Like maybe you can just show us some of the information that is not hypothetical that you're actually seeing. And then some of the questions that the Texas Tribune is starting to ask about, like where are opportunities for it to serve communities better or like anew?
Yeah. So it's not on this graph, but one thing that we found is, our current audience, we're actually serving them really well. They really love us, but also they're very much more likely to go directly to our website, for example. And what we found about these audiences that we're not really reaching that we want to is that they're much more active on platforms like social media. So not only are they using these platforms at higher rates than other groups, but they also have a more of a trust in it. So if something's happening, that might be the first place they go. They look there to verify stories, and they find credibility there. One thing that's not on this slide is also that most of these consumers, they are following what they call traditional sources on social media. So that's a place where, they're looking for our traditional sources to be. So they're assessing credibility by brand, but they're doing it on social. So I think this is important to the fundraising conversation because obviously products like newsletters, the website, that's great for donations. But when we're talking about actually serving people, it's really more probably on this platform space. And that's where you can get like maybe grant supported versus reader supported revenue to show that you're having the impact that you want and you're reaching people that they want to reach. If you want to advance one more. So this is just also reinforcing like younger Texans, Black Texans using social platforms at higher rates. Among Latinos, actually, we didn't find as much of a difference in the usage, but there was a difference within Spanish-speaking and bilingual Latinos who are using YouTube at higher rates. So that was interesting to us. And then similarly, if you want to advance to the next slide, a lot of television still. So especially for Spanish, this stood out a lot, is that people are getting news in Spanish and want news in Spanish, but they're primarily getting it through television. So this speaks to a couple of things. Is one, perhaps we need more video, but also, partnerships are still a good way to reach people. So we really need to have a very complex strategy around reaching these groups. All right. So I think we kind of hit on this, and I think there were a couple questions in the chat about how this relates to fundraising. So first of all, as we talked about in the top of the call, that benchmarking is really important. We were seeing a lot more requests for data about our audience and specifically reporting about diversity, rightly so. So the current, Google Analytics, that can give some great insight into page views, et cetera, but it's pretty weak on some of these demographic measures. So that benchmarking is really important for reporting and grant writing. The second thing, which is another example, someone asked about the term moderate, so I'm happy to share this one, is that we've used this research in addition to forming, our content strategy and other ideas in conversations with funders. So people may have misconceptions. We've had examples of funders either withdrawing or being hesitant about funding because they think our publication is liberal, for example. So in the graph at the bottom of this screen, one of the great things that we were really excited to see in our research is that our current audience and the consumer audience pretty much almost at the identical rate, 62-63%, perceived us as moderate. So even if a funder is perceiving that we are liberal, that's not the case for consumers. So it's really helpful for us to be able to bring this into the conversation, is that their perception also may be a little bit wrong about us and how our audience feels about us. And then lastly, again, back to the platform issue, having this work and having things be audience driven can make for stronger proposals because we're taking a research informed approach. And ultimately, at the end of the day, I think we all want to have impact, both funders and news organizations.
Yeah, and just to put it into some practical terms for how you talk to your audience itself too, like it's helpful there too, right? Like a lot of us are working on donation models and trying to figure out like what's gonna prompt someone to donate. And so the things we're talking about, Virginia just talked about, and then I'm going to talk about right now, this is all free for you to do. Like this is talking to your audience. That's easy and free, and you should be doing it. Like the market stuff is helpful, but like it's for big expansions. And here's something you can do for free. Like here's something Block Club did for free that I helped them do last year, which is they had a conversation with their audience and started to understand what segment of their audience had the capacity and the desire to give more by talking to them, by asking some really like pointed questions about it. They started to understand, why do they care about Block Club? Like as compared to other news organizations, what do they want to see Block Club do next? And who's the best spokesperson or example for you to use to show them that, to put that message forward to them? So for example, to bring it back to, Virginia's thing about benchmarking too, like this allows you to do some benchmarking too, like awareness of what you're doing and how attitudes are changing over time. Block Club started to do more investigations in a much more serious and much more high profile way. Did the audience notice that? Did they care about that in a way that stuck with them and changed their broader attitudes about who Block Club is and what the capacity they had to do was? So the research said, yes, this is something that they both really saw, but really stuck with them, particularly the Loretto Hospital investigation, which, if you're not familiar, was like a series of cascading corruption scandals at a West Side community hospital that was both kicked off by Kelly Bauer and really led by her, with the collaboration and support of lots of other news organizations in town too. But Kelly had a pretty lead role in breaking and carrying this story forward and won some awards for it. So when they went to their audience, they heard like, look, we saw this. We saw this as part of what you do. We saw this as something we want to see you do more of. So Block Club came out, and amongst all the other year-end giving campaigns, they did another one that was more targeted for this group. And they said, okay, well, what happens if we try and speak to this group directly of our audience and say like, hey, we want to do more of this. Your support will help us do more of this. Kelly is the one asking you to do this. If you don't remember Kelly, here's an added authority. Remember, someone else gave her an award because she's so good at this. Like, this campaign wrapped up a bunch of different questions and a bunch of different attitudes into a segment of Block Club's audience that was both most engaged, most willing to give, and best equipped to give. And honestly, they were giving not to help themselves, but giving to help other communities, right? To help expand the work into other communities. This was not people who lived in the community where the hospital story broke. And the results were like that this campaign, Seamus, the publisher there, said, I think it was $10,000 above all the other campaign asks for just a single one. Like it was more than double. So this is like, it had a significant impact. It was a significant motivator because they understood what was the connect for between their audience and what they were doing and how it could motivate them to give more. So it works with funders and it works with audiences too. And this is something that you can do for free now. So Virginia, you want to take the next one?
Yeah, sure. So, you know, as Sam said, like there are some barriers because, you know, we've done audience survey work in the past and it's typically like our current audience. And the benefit of doing a broader research study beyond our current audience is that we're not kind of designing for the core audience only, like we're thinking about paths to growth, right? And we're really thinking about how we can meet people's real needs. So I think one of the benefits for this is that if we had just done our audience survey only, we would probably have made a lot of different choices among our current audience. And I mentioned it was a lot older. There was more, you know, positive connection to nonpartisanship. So we would have said, oh, people love this. So we'll keep doing that thing, right? So kind of going beyond what we're doing now and exposing our blind spots was really important. So, and then I think generally too, just thinking more comprehensively about our mission and our brand and what that can mean to different people is really important. And just a reminder, you know, the nonprofit purpose. I think Sam kind of makes an interesting point about, you know, funding is coming from readers. And we find that too, is that our readers, even though they are among this like more educated white constituency, they're still an important constituency for us. And they are often very generous and wanting to also share the mission of serving more underserved Texans, right? So that's really important, right? They want their own information needs met, but they're giving to us because they care about other people as well. So how we tell that story and is really important to the fundraising model. And then as well too, for major donors or foundations, I think having this is rooted in impact, right? So having a research-informed strategy will really make it much more likely that we're able to deliver on these goals and prove that we are with the benchmarking.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of folks here probably know that it's about striking the right balance, and that the people who get your organization's mission and want to support it are not always the same as the communities most in need and that the organization is best equipped to serve. And so like understanding both your audience and going out there and doing some work around the communities that you think you're best equipped to serve is going to help you balance those things, because it's going to be a balance of like, sometimes you need to listen to your audience that like of what their needs are and what they want to serve. And sometimes you need to not listen to them. You need to go out and listen to the communities that most need your work and like that you're best equipped to serve. And it's about like finding the right balance between these two things as you grow is really tricky. And it's what like news leaders are tasked with. And this is the type of research that's really going to equip you with at least the kind of data that's going to help you make decisions, or at least ask the right sorts of questions too. Because like you're not going to be able to fly blind on it, and you can feel around a little bit. But there's a lot of stuff you can understand for free already. And there's a lot of stuff that isn't particularly challenging to understand. You don't need to have a statistician come in and help you with this stuff. Because like getting the balance between these two things right is really going to help you create a sustainable organization over time in your relationships with your audience. But I think it goes, I mean, to my mind, it probably goes beyond that too. I mean, Virginia, it's like, I mean, what's it for the Texas Tribune? Like, it's like a whole organizational thing, right?
Sure. So we definitely want time to answer some of these questions. So this is the grand finale slide here. But just making some more points to what's already been made is that just rooting in the research really helps with stakeholder alignment. So not only for funders and the newsroom, but just journalists too also have their biases. So the more that we're all serving the audience, the more that it just makes it easier to align around the goals, right? So there's kind of the classic story, right, of maybe the boss likes a certain story type or a certain design, and it's like you're designing the homepage for an audience of one. And also, many editors, they're on the homepage all day, like thinking about like how that looks. And reality is that most people aren't consuming news in that way. So it's like our own, and what we found in the research as well is that before maybe the recent ownership change, a lot of journalists are very heavy on Twitter, but a lot of our audiences are still on Facebook. So like some of our own personal behaviors and biases creep into our strategies, and the research is a way to kind of check us and make sure that we're actually serving people and not designing necessarily only for ourselves. So I think just having everybody informed about this research can really help that alignment happen, to align the funding opportunities with the work, and yeah, just really chart that path to growth and engaging more groups of people.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. We're going to open it up for Q&A. I'm going to start just with the Q&A in the chat here already. Virginia, I might throw some to you too, if you're ready. I can think of some examples too, but Rodney's asking if how research is affecting content strategy. For example, has it spurred new beats, story formats, or audience listening practices? I don't think you're on quite to that point yet, but I mean, how much do you think this is going to have an impact on content strategy?
Yeah, so this is definitely a work in progress. I think other than just the platform issue, when we're thinking just purely about content, we did have, and it wasn't part of this presentation, but a piece of the research asking specifically about content. My takeaway is really that a lot of this is about how we're framing the stories. So I think it's almost inherited from the print world, having things almost as a vertical. So like, for example, we have an environmental beat, so then we'll do an environment newsletter. Well, many people who are interested in the environment aren't really interested in the environment for the same reasons that like an environmentalist, so-called environmentalist will be. They're just really concerned about their children, their health and safety of their families. So I think the way we frame stories and products is really, really important. And I can see that that might be a change that would take place in the future, just how we're organizing content. Story formats, I think part of the reason we might see that our current audience is an older audience is they have more time. So that was another thing really reflected in the focus groups, is that people are more passive news consumers. They're not necessarily reading really long articles. If if they're not retired, they might be looking for more quick hits, or even like through their routines on radio or television in the morning. So thinking more about that is another area I think we'll be looking at.
Yeah, I can give a couple examples too. I mean, so for some of the organizations I work with, like for example, Southside Weekly, right? They understood after talking to their audience that the art that they used, the illustrations, was really like the thing that represented the brand for a lot of people. And so when they've been launching their membership program, they are using that artwork and those relationships much more strongly, like they did, for example, a partnership with an artist. It was the picture I showed earlier where they designed a t-shirt with a Southside artist in conjunction with Southside Weekly. And that was one of the things that would support the weekly as like swag thing that year, right? And that really came directly from the audience of talking to them. and it sold out. I was lucky to get one. Like it was gone really, really quickly. So it was a good sign of like, hey, this was a smart thing for us to invest in. I mean, and like, to be honest, like content strategy is really, I think, a good way to help you moderate the loudest voices in the room. For those of us in the nonprofit world, like that's often funders, right? Like funders are often really interested in the things that they fund. So they're really interested in, for example, investigations. But does that mean that there's an appetite for investigations? Does that mean there's a need for investigations? And how should that then be executed within the community? And we've all heard from funders like, oh, we'd like to see this become self-sustaining in X number of years. Like, well, okay, like what does that look like? So like the Block Club example is a good example of that, of hearing like, yes, this is actually a thing that does resonate with our audience. It's not just our funders' voices that we should be listening to here. It's all these other people too. And I'll say the final example that I'll give is one I've heard a lot too is when to moderate political reporting. Like it is a really challenging thing. There are a lot of very loud voices saying more political reporting, and I've seen it drive a lot of newsrooms into increasingly narrower and narrower paths where like they're just not appealing then to a lot of other people who don't structure their identity around a political identity. They're interested in politics, but their identity isn't a political identity. For example, like in the community I live in South Side of Chicago, like there's strong political interest, but people rarely structure in that way. They want to know what's happening with this vacant lot in my neighborhood. They're not starting that story from the zoning committee, which is where a political reporter might start that story. They're starting that story from the community of saying like, these are the type of resources that are missing from my neighborhood. This is the type of thing I would like to see developed here. I think there should be more low-income housing or affordable housing. I think there should be more options for food. I think there should be more restaurants, activities to do, cultural activities. And they're thinking about like their community life, and they're starting from there. And then they're working their way back to politics rather than starting at politics and working their way into this. And it's oftentimes like a way for us to help and moderate those sort of voices who are like, start from the political side and go from there. Start at city council and tell the stories that start in city council. No, like at times, like starting at the community is going to help you open up the political dimensions of lots of other things, and start to understand like, the people, I mean, to be honest, what I look at is like, who are the people who are asking for more political stuff? And they're often really concentrated into like a single demographic, a single income bracket, a single location often. I mean, I live in Chicago, so it's really segregated. So like they're often in like one specific part of the city. And they often have like no other interests, right? Which is what I want to avoid. Like, who are people who have a broad set of interests, who are coming to us for lots of things, who I have lots of ways to engage with them? And like, who are the people who are coming to me for one thing and then leaving, who are coming to for political coverage, and then that's the only thing they want? Like, they have a very siloed interest. Like, I know how to serve them because their interests are very narrow, but who are all these other people who I have lots of ways to engage with? So that's how it might inform content strategy, where I have to have a lot of conversations with newsrooms lately about like, how else could you start this reporting process so that you're not starting from a political standpoint, and you can see how it engages all these other people who are kind of loosely engaged with you and say they're really interested in things to do in the community, business openings, restaurants, like all of these things that are not necessarily political, but might have a political aspect where if you want to talk about liquor licenses, you could. So that's one way that I've seen it affect content strategy. Virginia, have you been looking at the questions? Do you think there's another you want to throw out the next one?
Well, I think a couple of people kind of touched on this. I did want to address partisanship because I think it's really interesting and it's particularly relevant to fundraising conversations. So you kind of touched on like political content and political, people wanting more of that. I think from our research, what was interesting is that we did that brand ideals exercise and people really weren't super into nonpartisan, but then, our perception was that people thought we were very moderate, which I think is sort of similar to nonpartisan. And we also had a section about trust, and it seemed like a bit of a contradiction, but one of the drivers of trust and people saying that they trusted a news source was kind of like a news source being nonpartisan, right? So the way we squared that is that people don't necessarily want to be told that we're nonpartisan. They might, they want to decide for themselves, right? So it's based on how we're doing the work that they want to decide if we're kind of delivering news in a way that they trust. They don't necessarily trust us because we're just calling ourselves nonpartisan. So I think that was an important finding. And then similarly with the funder conversation example that I showed, I think it is helpful to point to the research. Like, we're not having this argument, are we nonpartisan, are we not? We're just showing the research that people are perceiving us as moderate. So that's not an argument over any particular piece of content. It's just a nice way to kind of deflect the conversation to, this is just how people see us. So, and that's probably a good thing if you care about nonpartisanship.
Yeah. Just to like piggyback on that for a second, like we talk about politics a lot, but like it's different from being civically engaged. And that's often what we're more interested in as nonprofits. And that was something I was really interested in Chicago, of like what it meant and how news moved people's sort of like civic activities, which is something you all might want to ask about too, as you talk to your audiences. Is I'm not as interested in whether someone worked on a campaign, contributed to a candidate. I am interested in if they voted, but what I'm more interested in is if they went to a meeting, if they talked to their neighbors about something. I'm interested particularly, and I ask a lot of questions about this, of like, what action did you take? And like, I'll say like the correlations there were like really weak on a lot of stuff, of like, it didn't seem to have a lot of effect on whether someone like, worked for a candidate or not. Those are people who are already interested in politics, were already motivated, and were already in conversation with the people who are bugging them all the time in political worlds. What it had an effect on was typically people going to a community meeting. Like that was where like there was a real like shift of like, we did reporting and then people went to a meeting about it. They talked to a neighbor about it. Like these were like the things where there was like a direct response to it. Where often like we in the news flip it and we'll cover the meeting, right? And we'll cover what happened at the meeting. But it showed us like that, oh, if we want a specific civic action to be taken, like we often have to preview like what might seem a minor meeting because we want people to show up to it. Like that's the action that they take. Like if we report on action afterwards, we've kind of like neutered their ability to like take the civic action that they're kind of want to take or are most primed to take in reaction to news coverage. So like, I think like questions I've been starting to ask a lot more about are like questions about like those sort of civic activities. I've been asking more about like people's relationships with things, of like, do you see yourself represented in the coverage that we do? Because like, I mean, the things that the research shows really drives people building a relationship is if they've built a habit with you over time, like you're consistently part of the conversations they're having. And to be consistently part of the conversations they're having, you need to be in the communities that they're in. And communities are organized in lots of different ways. And that was the other thing, is like, yeah, I see this organization as part of a community that I'm also in. And those are the two big things. So I personally start to ask audiences a lot more about like those types of relationships that they have, of like, what communities are they a part of? Who's involved in the conversations in those communities? I mean, so the other thing is, Virginia, you're sharing a lot of this stuff with others in the news industry. Are you going to share this with people in your audience too? Like, how is that? Like, are you going to communicate this back to them in some way too?
Yeah, so we haven't done that at this point, but we know that is a best practice. So there's plenty of examples from other news organizations where you do the survey and then you say, hey, we listened to you, and now this is what we're going to do about it. So I think there's still opportunity for us to do that. Our study was like very comprehensive, so we're still kind of thinking through what these action items are. We're doing also smaller surveys. So I think somebody asked a question specifically about reader revenue. So I think it is important to survey, not just like in this really broad way, but we've surveyed by specific products, like for specific newsletters. And I think especially for those products, like sharing how you may have redesigned a product, for example, based on the survey feedback is important, and it's very much contained, right? Within that product, you can share the results of that. So anyway, yes, I think we will plan to do that, but haven't done so at this point and as a result of this research.
Yeah, I've seen some other newsrooms do similar things. Like, we've heard from you that you want to see us do X or Y, and now we're going to do. So we're going to put our efforts towards X or Y over the next year, right? Like, that's typically in the context
Yeah.
of like a donor campaign. I'm lucky that I got to do my market research in the context of a university where there was like strong incentives for us to share with everybody, including the public.
Mhm.
So, I mean, if, people are interested in markets, like you might not be in a newsroom the best person to do it. You might want to pressure a local university to be the one to take it on. Oftentimes they have better resources and expertise to take it on, because I mean, the one we did in Chicago was a benefit to everybody in Chicago because everyone sort of like knew their space a little bit better, knew the people they were working with a little bit better, and knew and understood the relationships they had with other newsrooms in a better way. Where like, when am I collaborating? When am I cooperating? When am I competing? And for a lot of them, it was like the first time that they saw like, well, I'm not really competing. Like, I have my space and I have my thing, and there's a lot of people who get what I'm doing and are coming in the door. So like, I'm feeling good. So I want to see if we have time for, well, I don't think we have time for maybe one more. No.
The session technically ends at noon, but I just wanted to remind everybody that there is the private messaging feature on Zoom events. So if you have questions directly for the presenters, please feel free to message them. But thank you so much, Virginia and Sam, for joining us today. I think everybody was very engaged and, was really interested in the work you guys are doing. So we just want to remind everyone that following the summit, we're going to share the recording of this session. Are you guys sharing a link to the slides? Would you be able to do that? I think somebody requested that in the Q&A.
Yep, that's good with me.
Okay.
And
perfect.
I forgot to put my email on the slide. I have kind of a complicated name, but you can reach me at RevLab at texastribune.org if you have questions.
And I'm at sam@inn.org.